Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It had been years since I'd seen my cousin Lindsay in person, but we'd always stayed in touch. Texts, birthday cards, a phone call here and there. When she told me she and her husband were moving back to town, I offered to help them settle in. It was partly family loyalty, but also something else. A restlessness, maybe. At 61, I'd found myself in that in-between stage of life. Widowed 3 years now, children grown and scattered, house too quiet, days too predictable. A visit from family seemed like a good distraction from the long, slow hum of routine. Their house was a lovely craftsman on the edge of the historic district, all stone porch and big windows, still littered with boxes and dust and the scent of fresh paint. I arrived in jeans and sneakers, ready to work. Lindsay greeted me with her usual tight hug and a mile-a-minute rundown of what still needed to be unpacked. "We've barely made a dent," she laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Jeremy's been doing most of the heavy lifting." Jeremy, her husband. I remembered meeting him at their wedding 15 years ago, a quiet, kind man with warm eyes and a steady presence. He was younger than Lindsay by 5 years, I think. At the time, I had thought they made an odd pair. She was a whirlwind of energy and charm. He was thoughtful, slower, like the anchor to her sail. He stepped in from the back porch as if summoned by name, wearing a worn gray t-shirt and holding a roll of packing tape. "Clara," he said with a surprised but easy smile. "It's good to see you again." "You too," I said, stepping forward. "I think it's been about a decade." "Maybe more," he replied. "You look well." There was something about the way he said it, sincere, not hollow. It landed softly in my chest. We spent the first part of the afternoon in a steady rhythm, cutting open boxes, folding paper, stacking books on shelves. Lindsay flitted from room to room, always starting one task before leaping to another. She'd call out to Jeremy every so often, "Did you see where I put the vase?" Or, "Don't forget we need to set up the Wi-Fi." Then disappear again with a grin. Jeremy and I ended up working side by side in the living room, unpacking boxes of framed photos and blankets. The conversation came easily. We talked about nothing at first, where they'd lived before, the drive across states, his new remote job. But as the afternoon settled into a quieter rhythm, the tone began to shift. "Lindsay says you've been on your own for a while now," he said gently as he passed me a stack of books. I nodded. 3 years this fall. He paused. "That's not easy." "No," I said softly. "It's not." He didn't rush to fill the silence, which I appreciated. Most people do. They try to smooth over the gaps with platitudes or nervous laughter. But Jeremy just handed me another book and gave me space. Some days, I continued after a moment, it feels like I've made peace with it. Other days, the quiet still surprises me. He nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a towel. "I think quiet does that. You get used to noise, shared mornings, a second coffee cup. Then one day it's just you, and it's like your own voice echoes too loud." I looked up at him. That's exactly it. He held my gaze for a second longer than was strictly necessary, but not in a way that made me uncomfortable. If anything, it was grounding, like someone seeing past the polite shell I'd built around myself these past few years. By late afternoon, Lindsay announced she was heading out to pick up dinner. "Chinese okay with you both?" she called over her shoulder. "Perfect," Jeremy answered. "Anything but spicy," I added with a smile. She grabbed her keys and was gone in a flurry of motion, her laughter still echoing down the hallway. I glanced at Jeremy. She hasn't changed a bit. He smiled, Not a bit. The house felt quieter with just the two of us again. The sun was dipping lower, casting amber light through the windows and across the hardwood floors. We had moved on to sorting a box of framed prints, the kind people hang in hallways to fill empty space. Sunsets, old maps, abstract pieces. Jeremy handed me one and said, "Do you ever feel like this stage of life is, I don't know, a strange kind of limbo?" I tilted my head. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, sitting back on his heels, "you're not young anymore. But you're not old either. You've done most of the big things. And then you're left wondering what's next, and whether anything meaningful still waits." I studied him for a moment. There was no drama in his voice, just quiet introspection. And it struck me how rarely people let themselves be vulnerable in such a simple way. "I do wonder that," I admitted. "I wonder if it's selfish to want more, or foolish. Like maybe we're supposed to just settle into memory and comfort." He looked at me carefully. "But what if more doesn't have to be big? What if it's just connection, understanding, not being invisible?" The words took my breath for a second. I swallowed hard and looked down at the print in my hands, an image of a single tree in a vast field, stark, beautiful, and a little lonely. "You're not invisible, Clara," he said. The room felt suddenly smaller, like the space between us had folded in on itself. I didn't know what to say, but my heart was thudding in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. There was something in his voice, in his stillness, that filled the room more deeply than touch ever could. I stood then, needing movement. "Would you help me carry these to the study?" I asked, gesturing toward the framed prints. "Of course." We worked in silence for a few minutes, the kind that buzzes with unspoken things. When the last frame was hung, I turned to find him watching me, not boldly, but with a softness that made my chest ache. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "if I said too much." "You didn't," I replied. "You just said something real, and that's rare." There was a pause, and then he gave me a small smile. "I'm glad it was you who showed up today." I smiled back. "So am I." As we walked back to the kitchen, I felt something shift inside me. Not a falling, not a spark. Something deeper. A door creaking open after being closed for too long. And I wasn't quite sure what was waiting on the other side, but I knew I was ready to find out. Lindsay returned from the takeout run in a whirlwind, balancing a paper bag in one hand and her phone in the other, breathless from the wind that had picked up outside. "I swear this town has gotten windier since we left," she said, dropping the bag on the kitchen counter. "You two get anything done while I was gone?" Jeremy and I exchanged a glance. Just a glance, but it felt weighted now, like there was more to notice in each other than there had been just hours earlier. I smiled and turned back to the plates I was setting out. We made a pretty good dent in the living room. Dinner was casual, the three of us around their small dining table eating noodles straight from the cartons, catching up on family stories and local gossip. But every so often, I'd catch Jeremy looking at me from across the table, those quiet, thoughtful glances that linger just a second longer than they should. And I'd look away, not because I was flustered, but because something about it made me feel exposed, in a way that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. After dinner, Lindsay disappeared upstairs to make a video call with her sister. She waved her phone at us on the way up and said, "I'll be a while. She wants to do a virtual tour of the house." Jeremy cleared the empty cartons and handed me a towel. "Want to help me with the dishes?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but in that moment, it felt like an invitation into something quieter. Something personal. I nodded. We moved easily around each other in the small kitchen, in rinsing, me drying. The window above the sink had fogged slightly from the steam, and outside the wind danced through the trees, making the shadows on the wall flicker. "So," he said softly, not looking at me, "earlier when I said that thing about connection, was that too much?" I paused for a moment, folding the towel in my hands. "No," I said. "It wasn't too much. It was honest. It felt real." He turned to face me then, leaning slightly against the counter, the plate forgotten in his hands. "I haven't been real in a long time, Clara. Not like that. Not even with Lindsay." The mention of her name pulled me back into the reality of the moment, the boundaries, the situation. But I didn't feel judgment or guilt in his tone, just a kind of confession, like he needed to say it aloud so it wouldn't keep twisting inside him. "I don't want to cross a line," he added. "And I don't expect anything from you. It felt good to talk to someone who didn't look at me like I was broken." I met his eyes. "You're not broken, Jeremy. You're just human, tired, maybe even a little lost, but not broken." A long silence followed. We just stood there, not speaking, while the last of the dishes dripped in the rack. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Do you think it's possible to feel something deep for someone you barely know?" The air in the kitchen seemed to still. "Yes," I said. "I think the heart knows things before the mind can catch up." His face softened, and he nodded, more to himself than to me. "That's how this feels. Not like infatuation. Not like a crush. Just like I've woken up a part of myself that I didn't realize had fallen asleep." My throat tightened, and I found myself looking down at the floor, not because I was ashamed, but because his words touched something in me that had been dormant too. "We're not supposed to feel this way, are we?" I whispered. "I don't know," he said, "but I do know we're feeling it." Just then, we heard footsteps upstairs and the low murmur of Lindsay's voice. The moment cracked like a bubble, and we both stepped back into the kitchen light, returning to the safety of motion. I packed up my things shortly after that. It was late, and I knew I needed time to think, to breathe, to process what was happening inside me. Jeremy walked me to the door. He didn't touch me. He didn't say anything inappropriate. He just looked at me with something soft and sincere in his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" I asked. "For listening, for not turning away." I gave him a small smile. "You don't have to pretend around me." "I know," he said. "That's why this scares me." The drive home was quiet. My hands rested on the wheel, but my thoughts were far from the road. I kept seeing his eyes, hearing his words, feeling the subtle shift in my own heart, a realization that I had opened myself to something I hadn't expected. Not romance, not fantasy, just possibility. When I got home, I sat in the driveway for a long time before going inside. My porch light buzzed overhead, the glow catching in the windshield. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that, but I knew something had begun between us. Something fragile, something real. And I also knew I didn't want to bury it. Not this time. The following week passed like a slow, echoing tide. I went about my days. Groceries, laundry, a few lunch dates with old friends, but everything felt slightly off axis. I'd smile, respond, not at the right moments, but inside, I kept drifting back to that quiet moment in the kitchen. Jeremy's voice. The way he'd looked at me, not with desire, not with desperation, but with recognition. I hadn't seen either of them since that evening. Lindsay had texted to say thank you again, with a string of emojis and promises to host a proper dinner once they'd settled in. Jeremy hadn't reached out. I told myself that was for the best. Still, when my phone rang one Thursday morning and I saw his name, my breath caught. "Hi," I answered, trying to sound even. "Hi," he said. "I hope it's okay that I called." "It is." A pause. "Lindsay's at her sister's today," he said. "She left early this morning. I thought, if you had time, maybe we could talk." There was a quiet understanding in his voice, a cautiousness that didn't ask too much, but hoped. I didn't hesitate. "I can be there in 20 minutes. The house looked different in daylight without the clutter of moving boxes. The furniture had found its places, the walls now held art, and the energy was calmer, settled. Jeremy opened the door, wearing a soft button-up shirt and jeans, barefoot on the wooden floor. "Thanks for coming," he said, stepping aside. He led me to the sunroom at the back of the house. It was warm and bright, with a small table, 2 chairs, and a window that overlooked the garden where light filtered through the trees like gold threads. "I didn't want to leave things unsaid," he said as we sat down. "Last week, what I said, it's been on my mind every day." "Mine too," I said quietly. He looked down at his hands, lacing and unlacing his fingers. I keep asking myself how something so small, a conversation, a glance, can stir so much. "Because we're not used to being seen anymore," I said. "Not as people, as selves. We play roles. We meet expectations. But we don't often let ourselves be real." Jeremy nodded. "With Lindsay, I've always been the steady one, the one who keeps things from falling apart. But somewhere in all of that, I stopped showing her the messy parts, and I think she stopped looking." "That happens," I said, watching the light dance across the floor. "Even in good marriages." "I'm not saying I want to leave," he said quickly, then paused. "But I also can't ignore what's been happening inside me since you walked in the door last week." His voice wasn't pleading. It was grounded, quiet. The voice of someone not chasing a fantasy, but wrestling with something deeply real. "I feel it too," I said, meeting his eyes. "I've spent the last 3 years missing connection, missing warmth, but convincing myself I was fine. And then you said those words, and it was like something shifted." "Clara," he said softly, "you make me feel awake again." I let those words settle, not because I needed more, but because I knew exactly what he meant. "I'm not trying to take you from anyone," I said. "And I'm not asking for anything. I don't want to pretend this didn't happen, that we didn't feel something real." He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, not in a hungry way, just in a quiet, grounding way, like a promise of honesty. His hand was warm, steady. The days that followed unfolded with a gentle quietness, like the hush of the world just before dawn. Jeremy didn't call every day, and I didn't expect him to. But when he did, our conversations stretched long, sometimes thoughtful, sometimes full of comfortable silence, like the pauses themselves were part of the language we were building. There was no plan, no roadmap. We both knew the reality of what stood between us, and yet neither of us turned away. One afternoon, Lindsay invited me to join them for a backyard lunch. It was casual, folding chairs, lemonade, Jeremy manning the grill with an apron and tongs, and Lindsay playing music from a speaker tucked under the porch awning. She looked happy, tired from the move, but happy. She chatted with me while setting the table, talking about garden plans and painting ideas, asking about my grandkids. Everything felt normal, and yet I was hyper-aware of Jeremy's movements, the way he glanced toward me, the quiet heaviness in the spaces between us. Later, while Lindsay was on the phone in the house, Jeremy walked over with a plate of sliced watermelon. "I've missed this," he said under his breath. "What?" I asked, knowing what he meant, but needing to hear it. "This feeling, like I'm more than a function." I took a piece and smiled gently. "You are." That night, I didn't sleep well. My mind kept circling back to Lindsay, to Jeremy, to the strange tenderness I carried for both of them, and how that tenderness had begun to split in two. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote it all down, every thought, every moment. I let the pages fill without judgment. I needed to see it. I needed to be honest with myself before I could be honest with anyone else. And that's when I knew I had to talk to Lindsay. I called and asked if we could meet, just the two of us. She suggested coffee at the little cafe by the courthouse, a quiet place with big windows and crooked tabletops. She arrived wearing a denim jacket and a scarf tied around her neck, looking every bit like the girl I grew up with, even now in her 50s. She smiled when she saw me, hugged me, ordered her usual chai. And then, as we sat, I took a breath and said the thing I'd been rehearsing for days. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I didn't plan for any of it. It just happened." Her smile faded, and she set her cup down slowly. "Jeremy and I have shared some conversations. Nothing physical, nothing inappropriate, but they've been meaningful to both of us. And I think it's only fair that you know." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just stared at me, eyes wide, lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she said, "I always knew there was something missing with him. I just didn't think it would show up like this." "I'm sorry," I whispered. She nodded, still staring. "I don't hate you, but I don't know what to do with this." "Neither do I admitted. "But I couldn't keep it from you. You deserve the truth." She picked up her cup again, took a sip, and said nothing for a long time. "I'll need space," she said eventually. "Of course." And with that she stood, said goodbye quietly, and left. I sat there for a while after she was gone, staring out the window, watching people cross the street like nothing had changed in their world. But mine had. Hers had. A few days passed. No calls from Jeremy. I understood why. And then, just as the ache of it had begun to settle into a dull hum, I found a note in my mailbox, folded in half with my name written on the front in his familiar handwriting. "Clara, I've been quiet because I wanted to give her room, but I haven't stopped thinking about you. Not just because of what we shared, but because of how you made me feel, seen, known, safe. I don't know where this leads or what's right anymore, but I know you helped me find a part of myself I thought was gone. And that's something I'll never forget. Jeremy." I folded the note carefully, held it to my chest, and closed my eyes. Maybe we wouldn't become anything. Maybe we'd fade into memory, into the quiet corners of our lives. But something beautiful had happened, and it mattered. Not because it ended in love or led to some bold decision, but because it reminded both of us that the heart still speaks, even when we stop listening. And sometimes just being heard is enough to change everything. We all carry boxes of regret, of longing, of questions. But sometimes, if we're lucky, someone comes along and helps us carry them. Not forever, just long enough for us to feel a little lighter. And sometimes that's all the healing we need.